It's October 24th, 1944, and Commander Richard O'Kane stands on the bridge of USS Tang, peering through the darkness at the Japanese convoy ahead. His submarine has become a legend in the Pacific, the most successful American submarine of the entire war. In just over a year of combat operations, Tang has sunk more enemy tonnage than any other boat in the fleet. 24 confirmed kills, 33 ships sent to the bottom. O'Kane himself has become the most decorated submarine commander in U.S. Navy history. But tonight, in the Formosa Strait between Taiwan and mainland China, none of that matters. What matters is the convoy ahead, silhouetted against the moonlit horizon. What matters is that Tang is running dangerously low on torpedoes. What matters is that after this patrol, after this attack, O'Kane and his crew of 87 men will finally go home. And they've been at sea for 51 days. They've dodged depth charges, survived air attacks, and pushed their luck further than any crew should. This is their 5th war patrol, their last war patrol. One more attack, O'Kane tells himself, one more convoy, then they can rest. The executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frank Springer, joins him on the bridge. The two men have been through hell together, have learned to read each other's thoughts in the heat of battle. Springer doesn't need to say anything. O'Kane knows what he's thinking. They're down to their last few torpedoes. They're in shallow water, barely 100 feet deep, with nowhere to hide if things go wrong. They're exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, their nerves frayed from nearly 2 months of constant tension, but neither man suggests breaking off the attack. That's not why they're here. That's not what Tang does. O'Kane has built his reputation on aggressive tactics, on taking risks that other commanders won't take, on pressing attacks when conventional wisdom says to withdraw. It's made him a hero. It's made Tang the most feared submarine in the Pacific, and tonight it will seal their fate. The convoy consists of 3 transport ships and at least 2 escorts. Through his binoculars, O'Kane can make out the distinctive shapes of Japanese cargo vessels riding high in the water. They're loaded, probably carrying troops and supplies to reinforce Japanese positions in the Philippines. Intelligence reports have indicated massive Japanese shipping movements in this area, and Tang has already proven those reports accurate. Just 2 nights ago, they sank a transport in these same waters. The Japanese know there's an American submarine operating in the strait. They're hunting for Tang right now, coordinating their search patterns, dropping depth charges on every suspicious sonar contact. The Tang should have left after that last attack, should have headed for deeper water, reloaded at a friendly port, let another boat take over the patrol. But O'Kane saw this convoy on the radar, saw the opportunity, and couldn't resist one more attack, one more contribution to the war effort, one more strike against the enemy before going home. He orders the crew to battle stations. Throughout the submarine, men spring into action with practiced efficiency. In the torpedo rooms, forward and aft, sailors prepare the weapons for firing. In the maneuvering room, electricians monitor the battery levels that will give them the speed they need for the attack run. In the conning tower, the fire control team sets up their calculations, plotting trajectories and angles. Tang creeps closer to the convoy, running on the surface to maintain speed and visibility. O'Kane prefers surface attacks at night. It gives him better situational awareness, faster maneuverability, and the ability to escape quickly if needed. Some submarine commanders prefer to submerge and attack from depth, but O'Kane has always been a surface fighter, aggressive, bold, fearless. The Tang closes to within 3,000 yards of the nearest transport. O'Kane can see the ship clearly now, can make out the details of her superstructure, the gun emplacements on her deck. He calls down his observations to the fire control team, giving them the data they need for a perfect solution. The first torpedo launches with a hiss of compressed air and a surge of bubbles. O'Kane watches its wake streak across the dark water toward the target. 46 seconds later, a massive explosion lights up the night as the torpedo slams into the transport's hull. The ship shudders, lists to port, and begins to settle in the water. The crew erupts in cheers, but O'Kane silences them immediately. They're not done yet. He swings Tang around for another shot at a second transport. The Japanese escorts are reacting now, their searchlights sweeping the water, their deck guns firing blindly into the darkness. Radio chatter fills the airwaves as they coordinate their response, but Tang is already moving, already repositioning for the next attack. O'Kane fires again. Another hit, another transport mortally wounded. The convoy is in chaos now, ships breaking formation, escorts racing around trying to locate the attacker. Tang has sunk 2 ships in less than 5 minutes, but O'Kane isn't satisfied. There's one more transport still untouched, trying to escape to the north, and Tang still has 2 torpedoes left, 2 more chances to add to their legendary tally, 2 more opportunities to hurt the enemy before this patrol ends. O'Kane makes his decision. They'll go after that last transport. They'll expend their remaining torpedoes. They'll make this a perfect patrol, a flawless ending to Tang's combat career. He orders a course change, pushing Tang to full speed on the surface, racing after the fleeing transport. The submarine's diesel engines roar as they chase their prey through the darkness. The crew is exhausted but exhilarated, riding the adrenaline of combat, trusting their commander's instincts as they've always done. Behind them, the 2 stricken transports are sinking, taking hundreds of Japanese soldiers and tons of supplies to the bottom. Around them, the escorts are converging, getting closer, their depth charges ready. Ahead of them, the last transport runs for its life, and in the torpedo room, 2 Mark 18 electric torpedoes wait in their tubes, ready to fire. Commander O'Kane doesn't know it yet, but one of those torpedoes is defective. One of those torpedoes will malfunction in a way that seems almost impossible. One of those torpedoes will doom his ship, kill most of his crew, and send him to a Japanese prison camp. One of those torpedoes will become one of the most tragic examples of friendly fire in naval history. But right now, in this moment, Richard O'Kane only knows that he has a target, he has torpedoes, and he has a reputation to uphold. The most successful submarine commander in the US Navy is about to fire his final shots of the war, and nothing will ever be the same. The Mark 18 electric torpedo was supposed to be a game changer, unlike the earlier Mark 14 steam torpedo that had plagued American 2 years of the war with its catastrophic failures. 18 meant Japanese ships couldn't take evasive action. In theory, it was the perfect weapon. In practice, it had problems, serious problems that the Navy knew about but hadn't fully solved. The Mark 18 was based on captured German G7E torpedo technology after the US Navy's disastrous experience with the Mark 14, which suffered from faulty depth control, defective magnetic exploders, and contact detonators that didn't work. They were desperate for an alternative. When they got their hands on German electric torpedoes, they reverse-engineered them, adapted them to American specifications, and rushed them into production. But the Mark 18 had inherited issues from its German parent and developed new ones in the translation. The depth control mechanism was temperamental. The gyroscope that kept the torpedo running straight could malfunction. The battery cells could short circuit, especially in the tropical heat of the Pacific. And most dangerously, the torpedo could sometimes suffer from what engineers called a circular run, where the steering system failed catastrophically and the weapon turned in a complete circle, coming back toward the submarine that fired it. The Navy knew about circular runs. They'd documented several cases. They'd issued warnings to submarine commanders. They'd modified the design to try to prevent it, but they couldn't eliminate the problem entirely. The complex interplay of gyroscope failure, rudder malfunction, and hydrodynamic forces meant that under certain conditions, a Mark 18 could become a boomerang, a 20-foot-long, half-ton boomerang carrying 575 pounds of Torpex high explosive. Most submarine commanders had heard stories about circular runs, but few had actually experienced one. The odds seemed low enough that the benefits of the electric torpedo outweighed the risks. And besides, what choice did they have? The Mark 14 had been even worse. At least the Mark 18 usually worked. Commander O'Kane knew about the circular run problem. Every submarine commander did. But in his year of commanding Tang, through 4 previous war patrols and dozens of attacks, he'd never had a torpedo malfunction in that particular way. He'd had torpedoes fail to launch, fail to run, fail to explode, but he'd never had one turn around and come back at him. The odds seemed astronomical. In the chaos of combat, with adrenaline pumping and decisions being made in split seconds, it was easy to push that tiny risk to the back of your mind. Tang had fired its second-to-last torpedo at the fleeing transport. O'Kane watched the weapon's phosphorescent wake disappear into the darkness, tracking toward the target. Any second now, there would be an explosion, another kill to add to Tang's record, but the seconds stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, no explosion. The torpedo had missed or malfunctioned or been a dud. It happened sometimes, even with the improved weapons. O'Kane cursed under his breath, but didn't hesitate. They had 1 torpedo left, 1 more chance. He ordered the final Mark 18 prepared for launch, gave the fire control team the updated targeting data, and waited for the solution. The last transport was still running, probably pushing its engines to maximum, its crew terrified after watching 2 of their sister ships go down. The Japanese escorts were getting closer, their search patterns tightening. Tang needed to fire soon and then get the hell out of the strait before those escorts pinned them down. Lieutenant Commander Springer voiced what they were all thinking. Time to leave, time to break off the attack. They'd done enough damage for one night. They'd sunk 2 transports, disrupted the convoy, completed a spectacularly successful patrol. There was no shame in saving that last torpedo, in heading for home with their victory secure, but O'Kane shook his head. They had 1 torpedo left. They had a target. They were the USS Tang, the most successful submarine in the Pacific Fleet. They didn't leave targets unsunk. They didn't go home with weapons unexpended, not when enemy ships were still floating. He gave the order to fire. The weapons officer in the conning tower below repeated the command, and the torpedo room crew sent the final Mark 18 on its way. Compressed air hissed, water rushed into the torpedo tube to maintain the submarine's trim, and the electric torpedo surged out into the dark waters of the Formosa Strait. O'Kane watched its wake through his binoculars, tracking the telltale trail of disturbed water as the weapon raced toward its target at 46 knots. The fire control solution had been good. The range was less than 1,000 yards now. The torpedo should hit in about 30 seconds, 20 seconds. O'Kane counted down in his head, anticipating the explosion. 15 seconds. He could see the transport clearly, could imagine the moment of impact, the satisfying bloom of fire and smoke. 10 seconds. Something was wrong. The wake wasn't tracking straight. O'Kane's experienced eye caught the deviation immediately. The torpedo's path was curving, bending to the left in a gentle arc that was growing tighter. His blood turned to ice. Circular run. The words flashed through his mind with terrible clarity. The torpedo was malfunctioning. The gyroscope had failed, or the rudder had jammed, or some combination of defects had turned their weapon into a death sentence. The Mark 18 was coming back around, coming back toward Tang. 5 seconds had passed since O'Kane noticed the curve. He had maybe 20 seconds before the torpedo completed its circle and came back at them. 20 seconds to save his ship and crew. 20 seconds to undo the consequence of that last fateful firing decision. He screamed orders, emergency dive, all ahead flank, hard left rudder, get the submarine underwater and away from the torpedo's path. The crew responded instantly, their training overriding their confusion. Men who didn't know what was happening trusted their commander's urgency and jumped to their tasks. The diving alarm blared. The bridge watch scrambled down the ladder into the conning tower. O'Kane was the last man on the bridge, watching in horror as the torpedo's wake completed its arc and straightened out, heading directly toward Tang. The submarine was diving, her bow tilting down, water washing over her forward deck. But submarines don't dive instantly. They need time to vent air from the ballast tanks, time to build downward momentum, time to slip beneath the surface. Tang didn't have that time. O'Kane dropped through the bridge hatch and yanked it shut above him just as he heard the lookouts shouting, "Torpedo in the water, torpedo incoming, starboard side." The words every submariner dreads, but this time those words came with a special horror. This wasn't an enemy torpedo. This was their own weapon coming home to kill them. In the control room, the diving officer was pushing the boat down as fast as physics would allow. The depth gauge needle crept downward, 20 feet, 30 feet. The conning tower was underwater now, but the stern was still on the surface, the propellers still churning foam as they tried to push Tang clear of the torpedo's path. It wasn't going to be enough. Commander O'Kane knew it. Lieutenant Commander Springer knew it. Every experienced man aboard knew it. They were out of time. The Mark 18 torpedo, carrying 575 pounds of high explosive running at 46 knots, struck USS Tang's stern at EEO 2:30 hours on October 25th, 1944. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire after section of the submarine disintegrated in a massive fireball. The stern torpedo room ceased to exist in an instant, along with every man inside it. The maneuvering room, where electricians had been desperately trying to coax more speed from the electric motors, was crushed and flooded. The after battery compartment breached. The forward engine room ripped open to the sea. Men died instantly, vaporized by the explosion or crushed by the collapsing pressure hull. Others found themselves in flooding compartments, surrounded by darkness and rushing water. With no time to escape, the submarine's stern sank immediately, pulling the rest of the boat down at a steep angle. In the forward section of Tang, men were thrown off their feet by the violence of the explosion. The lights went out instantly as the electrical system failed. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a hellish red glow. The roar of rushing water echoed through the bulkheads as the ocean poured into the shattered stern compartments. Commander O'Kane picked himself up from the deck of the conning tower where the blast had thrown him. His ears rang from the concussion. Around him, men were shouting, some in pain, others calling out damage reports that couldn't be heard over the chaos. He grabbed the nearest intercom and tried to raise the different compartments, tried to get a sense of how bad it was. The maneuvering room didn't answer. The after torpedo room didn't answer. The after engine room didn't answer. More than half his crew was back there, 30, maybe 40 men. He tried not to think about that, tried to focus on the men he could still save. The submarine was sinking stern first at a precipitous angle. The depth gauge was spinning wildly as Tang plummeted toward the bottom of the strait. They were in only 180 feet of water, shallow by submarine standards, but deep enough to kill them if the hull collapsed or if they couldn't stop the flooding. The diving officer was struggling to regain control, blowing ballast tanks, trying to get air into the buoyancy systems to arrest their descent. But with the entire stern section gone, Tang's weight distribution was catastrophically wrong. The boat wanted to sink tail first, and there wasn't enough buoyancy forward to compensate. At 120 feet, Tang's bow finally rose slightly. The flooding had reached an equilibrium of sorts. The watertight doors between compartments had held, sealing off the destroyed sections, but also trapping any survivors back there. The submarine settled onto the bottom of the Formosa Strait at a steep angle, her shattered stern buried in the mud, her bow pointed up at 30 degrees. The crew took stock of their situation. 30 men had survived in the forward compartments, 30 out of 87. The other 57 were dead, trapped, or cut off beyond reach. They had no power, no propulsion, no way to surface under control, no way to call for help. And they were in enemy waters, with Japanese escorts actively hunting for them right overhead. The men could hear the ships above them, the throb of propellers, the rhythmic ping of active sonar searching for their exact location. Any minute now, the depth charges would start falling. The Japanese knew there was a submarine down here. They'd seen Tang on the surface, had probably seen the explosion. They would drop depth charges until they were certain the submarine was destroyed. O'Kane gathered his officers, Lieutenant Commander Springer, Lieutenant Savadkin, Lieutenant Flanagan, the men who had survived, who were now responsible for getting the rest of the crew out of this death trap. They had two options for escape. The forward torpedo room had an escape trunk, a vertical tube that men could use to reach the surface. It was designed for exactly this situation. Trapped submariners in shallow water, needing to get out. Each man would enter the trunk, flood it with water to equalize pressure, then open the outer hatch and swim up. They had Momsen lungs, primitive breathing devices that would give them enough air to reach the surface from this depth. It would be dangerous. Men could get the bends from ascending too quickly. They could drown if they panicked, or if their Momsen lungs failed, they could be captured or killed by the Japanese ships waiting above. But it was their only chance. The alternative was to stay in the submarine and die when the air ran out or when Japanese depth charges cracked the hull open. O'Kane made the decision they would evacuate through the escape trunk. Every man who could make it to the forward torpedo room would attempt the ascent. They would take their chances with the ocean and the Japanese rather than die trapped in their steel coffin. The crew began preparing for the escape. Men checked their Momsen lungs, helped each other into the devices, tried to remember the training they'd received on submarine escape procedures, training that most of them had never expected to use in real combat conditions. The escape trunk could only accommodate 4 men at a time. That meant the evacuation would take multiple cycles with some men waiting while others went up. Each cycle would take several minutes to flood the trunk, equalize pressure, open the outer hatch, let the men swim out, close the hatch, and drain the trunk for the next group. Time they might not have if the Japanese started dropping depth charges. O'Kane insisted on going last, as was the tradition for any ship's captain. He would see every man off his boat before he saved himself, Springer argued, but O'Kane was adamant the commander would be the last man out. The first group entered the escape trunk, 4 sailors, young men barely out of their teens, terrified but determined. The inner hatch sealed behind them, the flooding valve opened, and seawater rushed in. The men felt the pressure building in their ears, in their sinuses as the trunk filled. When the pressure inside matched the pressure outside, they opened the outer hatch. Dark water yawned above them, leading up to a surface they couldn't see. One by one, they kicked off and swam up, following their bubbles, trusting the Momsen lungs to give them enough air, praying they wouldn't black out before reaching air. On the surface, the Japanese escorts continued their search. Searchlights swept the water. Lookouts scanned for any sign of survivors or debris. The ships knew the American submarine was down there somewhere, probably badly damaged, possibly sinking. They were patient. They could wait for dawn, then methodically depth charge every square meter of the strait until nothing could possibly be alive down there. Then the first American sailors broke the surface, gasping, exhausted, coughing up seawater, but alive. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Searchlights converged on the struggling men. The escorts altered course, moving in to investigate. The Americans floated in the dark water, watching the massive hulls of enemy warships bearing down on them. They had survived the torpedo explosion, survived the sinking, survived the escape from the submerged submarine, but now they were at the mercy of the Japanese Navy. Below, in Tang, the second group was entering the escape trunk. O'Kane watched the depth gauge, watched the overhead, listened for the sound of depth charges that would signal their doom. The evacuation continued. 4 men at a time, cycling through the escape trunk, swimming up through the dark water to an uncertain fate on the surface. Some made it, some didn't. Some drowned on the ascent, their mumps and lungs failing or their technique wrong. Some reached the surface but were too exhausted to stay afloat, slipping back under before the Japanese could reach them. Some blacked out from the pressure change or from holding their breath wrong. The escape was a desperate gamble, and not everyone won the bet. Commander O'Kane waited in the forward torpedo room with the final group of survivors. Around him, 8 men remained, 8 out of the original 87 who had been aboard Tang when the patrol began, 8 out of 30 who had survived the initial explosion. The escape attempts had taken a terrible toll. He'd sent men up in groups of 4, watched them disappear into the flooded trunk, hoped and prayed they'd make it to the surface. Some groups had been successful, others had ended in tragedy. Through the hull, O'Kane could hear the Japanese ships circling above. He could hear their propellers, the distinctive sound of destroyer screws cutting through the water. He could hear voices faint and distorted through the steel and water. Japanese sailors calling to each other as they fished American survivors from the sea. At least some of his crew had made it up. At least some would live, even if that life meant captivity in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. O'Kane knew what that meant. He'd read the intelligence reports about Japanese treatment of prisoners, the stories of torture, starvation, forced labor, the tales of men who disappeared into camps and were never heard from again. But even that fate was better than drowning in a sunken submarine, gasping for air as the oxygen slowly ran out and the carbon dioxide built up to toxic levels. The compartment's air was already getting stale. The chemical carbon dioxide scrubbers were exhausted. The temperature was rising as the confined space filled with the body heat of desperate men and the residual warmth from the now dead machinery. They needed to get out soon. The next group prepared to enter the trunk, 4 more men leaving O'Kane and 3 others for the final evacuation. Lieutenant Savadkin was among this group. He clasped O'Kane's hand, briefly a silent acknowledgement that this might be goodbye. If anything went wrong with the escape, if the trunk failed, or the Japanese decided to start dropping depth charges, the men left behind would have no second chance. Savadkin and his group entered the trunk. The process began again. Flooding, pressure equalization, the outer hatch opening. O'Kane watched through the small viewport as the men kicked off and swam upward, their forms disappearing into the darkness above. The trunk cycled. Now it was down to 4. Commander O'Kane, Lieutenant Commander Springer, and 2 enlisted men, motor machinists Mate Hayes and Torpedo Man's Mate Leibold. The last 4 survivors of USS Tang. They looked at each other in the red glow of the emergency lighting. Men who had been through hell together, who had sent 2 Japanese transports to the bottom just hours ago, who had thought they were going home as heroes. Instead, they were about to abandon their ship and surrender to the enemy. O'Kane made a decision. As captain, he should go last, but he also needed to ensure these men made it out. He needed to supervise the final escape, to make sure the trunk operated correctly, To give these young sailors the best possible chance, he ordered Springer and Hayes to go first. Springer protested, but O'Kane pulled rank. The executive officer and the machinist's mate entered the trunk. O'Kane and Leibold sealed the hatch behind them and began the flooding sequence from the outside controls. They watched through the viewport as water filled the trunk. As Springer and Hayes prepared for their ascent, the outer hatch opened. The two men kicked off and disappeared. O'Kane and Leibold were alone in the forward torpedo room of the sunken submarine. The last two men aboard. The boat creaked and groaned around them, settling deeper into the mud, the pressure of the sea squeezing the damaged hull. O'Kane looked around the compartment one last time. This had been his command, his home for over a year. USS Tang had been more than just a submarine. She'd been a legend, a boat that struck fear into the Japanese merchant marine, a vessel that had accomplished more than any other submarine in the Pacific Fleet. Now she was a tomb, resting on the bottom of the Formosa Strait, filled with the bodies of 57 good men. He thought about the torpedo, the Mark 18 that had malfunctioned, that had turned in a circle and come back to kill them. He thought about the decision to fire that last weapon, the decision to pursue that final transport instead of breaking off the attack and heading for home. He thought about all the small choices that had led to this moment, alone in a flooded compartment with one other survivor, preparing to swim up into the hands of the enemy. It would haunt him for the rest of his life. O'Kane and Leibold entered the escape trunk together. They sealed the inner hatch, knowing that once they left, Tang would be truly abandoned. The flooding valve opened. Seawater rushed in, shockingly cold, rising around their legs, their waists, their chests. They kept their faces above the rising water as long as possible, breathing deeply, preparing their lungs for the ascent. The Momsen lung devices were crude but effective, rebreather systems that would recycle their breath and scrub out the carbon dioxide. In theory, they provided enough air to reach the surface from depths up to 200 feet. Tang was at 180 feet. It should work. The water reached their necks, their chins. They took final deep breaths through the Momsen lungs and ducked under as the water rose over their heads. The trunk was completely flooded now. O'Kane reached for the outer hatch wheel and spun it. The hatch swung open, revealing the dark water above. He gestured to Leibold to go first, then followed behind. The two men kicked off from the submarine and began their ascent. O'Kane looked down one last time as he swam upward. Below him, USS Tang was already disappearing into the darkness, a darker shadow against the black water. His boat, his command, gone. He turned his attention upward and swam toward the surface, toward whatever fate awaited him there. The ascent seemed to take forever. O'Kane's lungs burned despite the Momsen lung. His ears ached from the pressure change. He had to fight the instinct to swim faster, to rush toward the air above. Ascending too quickly would give him decompression sickness, the bends which could cripple or kill him. He forced himself to maintain a steady pace, exhaling slowly to prevent his lungs from overexpanding as the pressure decreased. Above him, he could see Leibold's form, a dark shape silhouetted against the slightly lighter water near the surface. The younger man was swimming strong, following his training, doing everything right. They were going to make it. Both of them were going to survive this nightmare. Then O'Kane's Momsen lung failed. He felt it suddenly, a change in the resistance as he tried to inhale. The chemical cartridge that scrubbed the carbon dioxide had become saturated. The device was no longer recycling his breath effectively. He was breathing his own exhaust, taking in carbon dioxide instead of oxygen. His vision started to narrow. His head swam. He kicked harder, trying to reach the surface before he blacked out. He could see light now. The faint glow of the pre-dawn sky filtered through the water. He was close, so close. His consciousness began to fade. The last thing Commander Richard O'Kane remembered was breaking through the surface of the Formosa Strait, gasping for air, seeing the dark hulls of Japanese destroyers around him. Then nothing. On the deck of the Japanese escort ship, sailors pulled the unconscious American from the water. They didn't know who he was yet, didn't realize they'd just captured the most successful submarine commander in the U.S. Navy. They laid him out on the deck and began attempting to revive him, more out of curiosity about what intelligence he might provide than out of any humanitarian concern. O'Kane coughed, vomited seawater, and gradually regained consciousness. The first thing he saw was a circle of Japanese faces looking down at him. The first thing he felt was the rough wooden deck beneath his back. The first thing he understood was that he was a prisoner. Around him, other survivors from Tang were being hauled aboard. Leibold was there alive, coughing but conscious. Springer had made it. Hayes had made it. Savardkin was there. A handful of others. O'Kane tried to count them but couldn't focus. His head throbbed and his lungs felt like they were on fire. The Japanese sailors pulled the Americans to their feet and herded them together on the deck. 9 men total. 9 survivors out of 87 crew members. 9 men who would spend the next 10 months in Japanese captivity, enduring interrogation, torture, starvation, and forced labor. 9 men who would barely survive until the war's end, but they had survived. Against impossible odds, after their own torpedo had destroyed their submarine, after swimming up from a sunken boat in enemy waters, after being captured by a navy known for its brutal treatment of prisoners, they had survived. And Commander Richard O'Kane, semi-conscious and in shock, was among them. The Japanese destroyer escort altered course and headed toward the Taiwanese port of Keelung, carrying its unexpected prisoners. In the pale light of dawn, the full scope of the disaster became visible. Debris floated on the surface of the strait, scattered remnants of USS Tang, life jackets, wooden planks, personal effects, and oil slicks marked where the submarine had gone down. Bodies floated among the debris, American sailors who had died during the explosion or drowned during the escape attempts. The Japanese ships methodically searched the area, looking for more survivors but finding only the dead. On the destroyer's deck, the 9 Americans were stripped of their wet clothing and given rough blankets. Japanese sailors searched through their personal effects, looking for anything of intelligence value. O'Kane watched as they confiscated his academy ring, his wallet with photos of his family, the small notebook he'd kept in his pocket. Everything that connected him to his former life was being taken away. A Japanese officer approached one who spoke some English. He demanded to know the name of their submarine, its mission, its capabilities. The Americans remained silent, giving only name, rank, and service number as required by the Geneva Convention. The officer's questions became more aggressive. When the Americans still refused to answer, he ordered them separated. O'Kane was dragged to one part of the deck, Springer to another. They were going to be interrogated individually, played against each other, pressured to reveal information. O'Kane knew what was coming. He'd been briefed on Japanese interrogation techniques, on what to expect if captured. The beatings, the water torture, the psychological manipulation. He steeled himself for what lay ahead. The destroyer reached Keelung Harbor by mid-morning. The prisoners were transferred ashore and taken to a military facility for processing. This was where the real interrogation would begin, where trained intelligence officers would take over from the ship's crew. O'Kane and his men were separated into individual small concrete rooms with barred windows. The isolation was immediate and total. For days they saw no one except the guards, who brought meager rations of rice and water twice a day. The isolation was a technique designed to break down their resistance, make them desperate for human contact, willing to talk, just to have someone to speak with. On the fourth day, they came for O'Kane. He was taken to an interrogation room where a Japanese naval intelligence officer waited, flanked by guards with rifles. The officer spoke excellent English, educated in America before the war. He knew about submarines, knew about the American submarine campaign in the Pacific. He wanted to know about Tang specifically. What were its capabilities? What were its successes? How many ships had it sunk? What were the American submarine tactics? Where were the other submarines operating? What were the next targets? O'Kane refused to answer. Name, rank, service number, nothing else. The beatings began. The guards worked him over with fists and boots, methodical and practiced. They broke his ribs, blackened his eyes, split his lips. When he still refused to talk, they moved to more sophisticated methods. Water torture, where they held him down and poured water into his nose and mouth until he thought he would drown. Electric shocks, stress positions where he was forced to hold painful poses for hours. Through it all, O'Kane maintained his silence. He gave them nothing of value. He protected his crew, protected the submarine service, protected the operational security that could cost other American lives if compromised. The other survivors endured similar treatment. Springer was beaten until he could barely stand. Savadkin was tortured with bamboo splinters under his fingernails. The enlisted men suffered even worse, as the Japanese assumed they would be easier to break, but Tang's crew held firm. They had been the best submarine crew in the Pacific Fleet. They remained the best even in captivity, refusing to give their captors anything useful. After weeks of failed interrogation, the Japanese gave up and transferred the prisoners to a POW camp. This was Ofuna, a secret facility near Yokohama, where captured submariners and airmen were held. Ofuna was not registered with the International Red Cross, meaning it officially didn't exist. Prisoners there had no rights, no protections, no hope of outside inspection or relief. The conditions at Ofuna were deliberately brutal: starvation rations, often just a small bowl of rice and weak soup twice a day, no medical care, forced labor, despite malnutrition and illness, random beatings from guards, solitary confinement in tiny cells for infractions real or imagined, psychological torture designed to break the men's spirits. O'Kane and his crew struggled to survive. The robust, healthy men who had escaped from Tang gradually became emaciated shadows. Disease was rampant in the camp: dysentery, beriberi, pneumonia. Men died regularly, their bodies simply giving out from malnutrition and abuse. The Tang survivors lost weight, lost teeth, lost their health, but they didn't lose their discipline. They maintained a covert command structure, with O'Kane as the senior officer making decisions for the group. They shared food when one man was particularly weak. They cared for each other through illness. They maintained their humanity and their military bearing even as everything else was stripped away. Winter of 1944-45 was particularly brutal. The prisoners had inadequate clothing for the cold, and heating in the barracks was non-existent. Men huddled together for warmth, but still several prisoners died of exposure and pneumonia. O'Kane himself came close to death multiple times. Ravaged by dysentery and malnutrition, he dropped to barely 90 pounds, his body consuming itself to stay alive, and Springer and the others weren't in much better condition. They all looked like walking corpses, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and protruding bones. Through it all, they heard rumors of the war's progress. Guards would occasionally let slip information, or new prisoners would arrive with news from the outside. The Americans were advancing across the Pacific. The Philippines had been retaken. Iwo Jima had fallen. Okinawa was under assault. The war was moving closer to Japan itself. The prisoners allowed themselves to hope carefully and quietly that they might live to see liberation. But as the American advance continued, conditions in the camp deteriorated further. Food became even more scarce as Japan's supply lines collapsed. The guards became more brutal, taking out their frustration and fear on the prisoners. There was talk among the captives that if the Americans invaded Japan, the guards had orders to execute all prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. Every day became a balance between hope and dread. In August 1945, something changed. The guards were agitated, frightened even. Rumors spread through the camp about some kind of superweapon, massive explosions that had destroyed entire cities. The prisoners didn't know what to make of it. Then, on August 15th, the guards simply disappeared. The prisoners woke up to find the camp unattended, the gates unlocked, the guards fled in the night. For several hours, the prisoners didn't know what to do. Was it a trick? A test to see if they would try to escape so the guards could shoot them? They remained in the camp, cautious, uncertain. Then American aircraft appeared overhead, dropping supplies instead of bombs. Parachutes bloomed in the sky, carrying food, medicine, clothing. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. They had survived. O'Kane and the other Tang survivors were eventually evacuated by American forces. They were taken to hospitals, given medical treatment, slowly nursed back to health. O'Kane weighed less than 100 pounds when he was liberated. It would take months of recovery before he was strong enough to travel back to the United States. During his recovery, O'Kane learned the full extent of Tang's final patrol. He learned that only 9 men had survived out of 87. He learned the names of all the men who had died, men he had commanded, men whose deaths he felt responsible for. He learned that Tang had officially been credited with sinking 2 transports that night, bringing her total to 33 ships sunk, making her the most successful American submarine of the entire war. He also learned about the Mark 18 torpedo. The Navy had conducted an investigation into Tang's loss. They had interviewed the survivors, analyzed the circumstances, and concluded that a circular run was the most likely cause. The defective torpedo had come back and destroyed the very submarine that fired it. It was a tragic, almost impossible failure, a 1-in-a-million malfunction that had killed 78 men. The Navy made modifications to prevent future circular runs, improved the Mark 18's gyroscope and steering systems, issued new firing procedures. But for Tang and her crew, those improvements came too late. O'Kane struggled with survivor's guilt and the weight of command decisions. He had made the choice to fire that last torpedo. He had decided to pursue that final transport instead of breaking off the attack. He had pushed Tang into harm's way one more time, and it had cost the lives of most of his crew. No amount of reassurance from the Navy, no recognition of his heroism could ease that burden. Yet when he returned to the United States in late 1945, he was treated as a hero. The public learned about his ordeal, about Tang's incredible record, about his survival and captivity. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, for his actions during Tang's final patrol and for his conduct as a prisoner of war. He received the award from President Harry Truman in a ceremony at the White House, along with the other Tang survivors who received their own decorations for valor. O'Kane stood at attention in his dress uniform, the medal heavy around his neck, and felt like a fraud. The other men deserved their medals. The men who had died aboard Tang deserved recognition. But him, he had fired the torpedo that killed them. He had survived when they hadn't. How was that heroic? In the years after the war, O'Kane struggled to reconcile his legacy. He was celebrated as the most successful submarine commander in American history. Books were written about Tang's exploits. His tactics were studied at the Naval Academy. Young submarine officers looked up to him as the ideal of aggressive, effective leadership. But he knew the price of that success. He knew that his aggressive tactics, his willingness to take risks, his determination to sink one more ship had ultimately cost him his boat and most of his crew. He suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in that era it wasn't well understood or treated. He had nightmares about the explosion, about the sinking, about watching his men die. He would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the roar of rushing water, feeling the submarine tilting beneath him. He bore the invisible scars of his experience for the rest of his life. O'Kane remained in the Navy after the war, serving in various capacities until his retirement in 1957. He never commanded another submarine. The Navy offered, but he declined. He couldn't bring himself to take another boat to sea, couldn't risk another crew. Instead, he served in training and administrative roles, passing on his knowledge to the next generation of submarine officers without putting himself in a position where his decisions could cost lives. After retirement, he wrote a memoir titled Clear the Bridge, detailing his experiences aboard Tang. The book became a classic of submarine warfare literature, praised for its vivid descriptions and honest accounting of both victories and failures. O'Kane didn't shy away from describing the circular run, the sinking, the guilt he carried. He wanted people to understand the reality of submarine warfare, not just the glory, but the tragedy as well. He maintained contact with the other Tang survivors throughout his life. They would gather periodically, these 9 men who had been through hell together, who had survived the unsurvivable. They were bonded in a way that no one else could understand. They had watched their shipmates die, had barely escaped death themselves, had endured captivity and torture, and had somehow made it home. That shared experience created a connection stronger than family. O'Kane lived until 1994, dying at the age of 83. In his final years, he was still haunted by that night in the Formosa Strait, still questioning his decisions, still mourning his crew. The Medal of Honor sat in a display case in his home, but he rarely looked at it. It represented both his greatest triumph and his greatest tragedy, inseparable and eternal. The USS Tang herself remains on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait, 200 feet down, a war grave holding the bodies of 78 American sailors. The site has never been disturbed. The Navy considers it hallowed ground, a monument to the men who died there. Occasionally, divers have visited the wreck, documenting its condition, paying respects. The submarine is remarkably intact despite the torpedo damage, resting at a steep angle with her stern buried in the mud. Inside, in the flooded compartments, the remains of her crew stay at their posts, eternal guardians of America's most successful submarine. Commander Richard O'Kane's story became a cautionary tale in submarine warfare training. Naval Academy instructors used Tang's final patrol to teach important lessons about risk management, mechanical reliability, and the consequences of aggressive tactics. The circular run that destroyed Tang led to significant improvements in torpedo technology and firing procedures. Modern torpedoes have multiple redundant safety systems to prevent the kind of malfunction that doomed Tang. They have self-destruct mechanisms that activate if the weapon deviates from its intended course. They have sophisticated guidance systems that make circular runs virtually impossible. These improvements came too late for Tang, but they have saved countless lives since. The Mark 18 torpedo was eventually phased out entirely, replaced by more reliable weapons, but its legacy lives on in the cautionary tales of submarine warfare, the stories of weapons that killed the men who fired them. The story of USS Tang and her final patrol embodies one of the great ironies of warfare, that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the enemy, but from your own weapons, your own decisions, your own aggressive pursuit of victory. O'Kane had been the most successful submarine commander in the Pacific, had sunk more enemy tonnage than anyone else, had earned the respect and admiration of his peers and superiors, but that success came with a cost that he paid for the rest of his life. The knowledge that his final decision to fire one more torpedo had killed 78 of his own men. The torpedo that shouldn't have worked, that shouldn't have turned around, that shouldn't have destroyed its own submarine, remains one of the most tragic examples of friendly fire in naval history. It stands as a reminder that in war, victory and tragedy often walk hand in hand, that the line between heroism and disaster can be measured in seconds and inches, and that the weapons we create to destroy our enemies can sometimes destroy us instead. Commander Richard O'Kane received his nation's highest honor, survived captivity and torture, lived a long life, and died, knowing that his name would forever be associated with both the greatest success and the most tragic loss in American submarine warfare. The Medal of Honor around his neck could never be heavy enough to match the weight of the memory he carried, the ghost of that circular wake in the darkness, coming home to kill the men he was sworn to protect.